Well, homesick today, unfortunately, but I guess the benefit is I get to play a little more Magic. Anyhow, I haven't made any changes to the Breya list. It's been performing very, very well for me. I will scroll down so that you can get a sense of the rest of the lands. On the left there, below the three snow-covered islands, is Steam Vents Tundra, Underground Sea Verdant Catacombs, Volcanic Island, Wasteland, Watery Grave, Windswept Heath, and Wooded Foothills. So no change at all to any of that. If you didn't catch it in the previous video, Bajuka Bog, back to being City of Traders, much more powerful and broken. That's what we like. So let's get right to the games. And my first attempt to 5-0, I made a very bad play mistake in round one. I lost. I was kind of irked with myself, so I just dropped from it, calmed down, started a new one, and this is that result. So round one, I played Philly the Kid, up to tied now. Lundstrom is keeping pace at 13-0, or 13 wins anyway. Oop. Okay, let's see if we can get this thing moving. So, all right, I had to mulligan, and I'm playing against Vile Smasher Kurum again. But I've got a great hand. So Cavern of Souls and Palace Jailer together in the same hand against this deck is very strong. I was a little unhappy to see his Demonic Tutor here. I have no idea what he went and got. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to sequence my hand. And I decide I'm going to Demonic Tutor as well. And what I'm doing is I could have Merchant Scrolled for days here, but I wanted to disguise what I fetched. So he goes in, because I have a Swords of Plowshares, I'm not as worried about Vile Smash right now. I'm planning to Swords it now and Jailer later. So I go ahead and Swords, and I top decked an Imperial Seal, which was very nice, so I go ahead and Seal. And I'm pretty sure this is probably what he Demonic Tutored for, either that or the land, but I'm able to daze it either way and then play land tax, tap 2 lands, replay my land from daze, cast Merchant Scroll, and this way I go get Gush. If he hits a land drop, great. If he doesn't hit a land drop, then as soon as I hit an island, I can actually rewind my mana deployment and move into land tax mode. So I try an Azorius Signet, which he remands back to my hand. He still hasn't played a land, and then he plays Dark Confidant. So I tried a Knight's Whisper. I probably should have played Signet here first. It's better to generate mana before cards. But I don't, and I pay for it with a Flusterstorm on his part. And then he plays Legacy's Allure and passes. I drew a lucky Force of Will here, so I go ahead and get Signet down. And my opponent gets to draw yet another card off Dark Confidant. At this point, he's got Spell Snare and Force Spike that we know about, but he has 9 cards in hand, so he actually has to discard the hand size, and he throws away the Spell Snare. So my turn, I play an Uncounterable Palace Jailer on the Confidant, and draw a card. And we have completely reversed things. I also found a Watery Grave. So I play the Watery Grave because I'm going to be able to Gush. And if I need to Force a Will, I needed to have 1 mana untapped for the Force Spike that I know he's holding. So I go ahead and cast an Uncounterable Breya. Legacy's Allure is at 2, so I needed to get a creature into play in case he stole Palace Jailer. Because if he then hit me with it, he would become the Monarch. We can't have that. So my turn, I find myself in Izzet Boilerworks, play that. Draw for the Monarch and pass. I've got Counterflux up. I've got Jace that I can force with, Gush that I can Gush with, I guess. And Counterflux to stop his Toxic Deluge. And with an uncounterable counter for his Toxic Deluge and him unable to answer that back, he's looking at being only at 13 life. He's probably going to have to sack his... I mean, he can't take the full hit for, what is that, 4-8 damage. Here, and drop down to 5. I think that would be fairly crazy. So he would probably have to have used Legacy's Allure during my attack step on Breya. And as a result, I could have either played Jace and tried to bounce Breya back to my hand, or just sacked Breya and like a flyer in response. And I probably would have gone with the second route because it's just safer. I would have sacked Breya, a flyer, hit him for 3 more, probably played Jace or Gushed. Like at this point, I mean, I have so many cards coming in. I'm going to draw a card at the end of my turn as well. It's just, there's no coming back from it. So I agree with my opponent's decision to scoop it up there. And we move to round 2. And this is against Skaboom47, who is playing... Yes, I had to ask my opponent my opponent gets Thraben Inspector out early, and I ask him, is he a Thraben who inspects things, or does he inspect Thrabens? Is he a Thraben who is an inspector, or is he a Thraben Inspector? So we'll see. Anyway, my opponent's playing Grand Arbiter Augustin. I said, it's interesting to see a new commander, but my understanding is that commander is only good with Sol Ring, Crypt, and Vault, so we'll find out if that understanding is incorrect or not. I'm going second, but I did get turn 1 land tax, so I tax up with a natural scroll rack to go with it, and because my opponent played Thraben Inspector, I can just run the scroll rack out with a fair amount of impunity, and it lands. He then taps out for Sword of Feast and Famine, and I tax up further, I believe. Wait to see what I draw, since I could always Mystical Tutor and put something in my hand, and I top deck a Vindicate. Sweet. So land, Vindicate, go away sword. He hits me with Thraben, plays his commander. So during my upkeep, I have tax on the stack. I activate scroll rack. Generally, you want to scroll rack on your opponent's turn, not during your upkeep, but in this particular case, it worked out very nicely. Because I find Enlightened Tutor a fetch land that produces white and Swords to Plowshares. And I draw for the turn as foretold. So I go ahead and fetch up a land to pay the tax on the Swords to Plowshares, and this frees me up to Enlightened Tutor, but because I also have in Mystical Tutor, I decide Mystical over Enlighten. And I just go for it right away. My opponent plays Council's Judgment on his turn, so I have lost my scroll rack, unfortunately. Alright, so the card I went for was Force of Will, because I had tax rack running, I thought. I try for As Foretold. My opponent remands it back to my hand. I can roll with that. Taking more Thraben Inspector beats. The Thrabens have been thoroughly inspected at this point. I try for an end of turn Enlightened Tutor. My opponent Spellstutter sprites it. I'm not super concerned with that. What I really want to resolve is this card for As Foretold. And my opponent's down to 3 cards in hand. In response to As Foretold, he plays Click, which is interesting. He should have played it during my draw step. But anyway, I counterflux it away, saving Force of Will for another day, hopefully. And As Foretold is down. My opponent sacks his clue. He finally gets a clue and digs for a solution As Foretold or even a land drop, which he misses. Doesn't find one and passes. On my turn, I get to draw Cryptic Command. So I'm taking a little bit of beats here. Nothing to be concerned about. And I impulse during my opponent's end step for Forbid. Snapcaster Impulse right back. And Impulse again. This time taking Palace Jailer. Alright, As Foretold is on 2 now. Now, one thing you don't want to do with As Foretold is use it to cast Painful Truths, by the way. And I think you can probably work out why that's a bad idea. But I just point that out in case you have the instinct to do so. So, opponent tries an end of turn Fact or Fiction for me. I try Cryptic Command, targeting Snapcaster for a bounce in response. My opponent Flusterstorms it. So I was going to bounce Snapcaster to my hand, and then I could As Foretold him down for free. Anyway, I end up splitting my opponent's Fact or Fiction so that he decides to take Remove Soul and Ponder over plain Sun Titan Bribery. And I go ahead and trade off my Snapcaster for his Thraben Inspector. So now we're just down to Fairy Beats. My turn to cast Painful Truths using real mana, of course, and then Forbid for free. My opponent has a Dispel for the Forbid, and I Force a Will that with Treachery. And go ahead and Izzet Boilerworks land into my hand and pass. Opponent hits me with Spellstutter Sprite on his turn. Casts Detention Sphere, so I think about hard casting Deprive and decide I'll just As Foretold it instead. Still have to pick up a land though. And on my turn, that allows me to tax. So I'm going to go ahead and snag an extra land here. The last card into my hand. And I can cast Ancestral Visions off of As Foretold. My opponent tries to negate it. I'm not fighting over that. Not that I could anyway. And I go for Palace Jailer. Now this I'll fight over. My opponent plays Remove Soul. We're going to play days by picking up an island here, specifically because I want to get all 3 islands into my hand. Because I'm hoping, well, I was trying to get mana into my hand because I'm hoping to find an Armageddon effect. So I get to draw a card off Palace Jailer. I find Talisman's not too helpful. Set land tax to always know, always yield. And then I probably sequence this wrong, but I cast Breya using As Foretold, and my opponent with his last card in hand has a counterspell. So I have to spend 1 mana to pay Breya's tax, and then I Merchant Scroll and spend another mana to pay for that tax. Then I go get Mystical Teachings in my opponent's upkeep. I cast Teachings for free with As Foretold, but I have to pay 1 for Breya's tax. And then I Lightning Bolt, or for Grand Arbiter Augustin's tax, and then I Lightning Bolt it and pay the tax on the bolt, completely tapping out. But I can now cast Breya for 1 As Foretold activation plus 2 mana for the commander tax. I save Palace Jailer in my hand. It's a backup in case anything goes funky. Opponent's got a Reflector Mage in play, and that's it. And at that, my opponent scoops it up. I've got 6 cards in hand, plus all the permanents that you see in play. My opponent has 1 card in hand that apparently is not a very action-oriented card, and I'm drawing 2 cards per turn. So I'm drawing 2 cards per turn and playing 2 cards per turn for free off of As Foretold. That's probably enough to win a game. It's probably enough to win most games. All right, match 3. Sebastian Pozo. So, Sebastian Pozo is playing. Let's see if we can close it out here. Yep, Crom Vial Smasher again. All right. So I got first turn, Watery Grave comes into play tapped. I'm going second. My opponent ponders. And this means that he doesn't have like turn 2, and he floats an Ancestral Vision, so he doesn't have turn 2 Vial Smasher, which is key. But he does have turn 3 Liliana. Luckily, I'm holding Mana Leak. And it lands. So I drew Weathered Wayfarer. I thought about the best way to play this out and decide Wayfarer into drawing 2 cards seems to be the way. My opponent dismembers it, and I think Weathered Wayfarer is so fragile. If he had any other removal, he would have played it. So that's a little telling about his hand. I play Chrome Mox, but my opponent stifles the enter play ability, so it's not going to do anything. I play Merchant Scroll, but he's Shadow of Doubts, so I don't get to search. So I play Ponder instead and set up the top of my library with... I actually had the opportunity there to Winter Orb him, but I set up the top of my library with Grim Monolith instead, thinking that the amount of mana I have would threaten him. And it did. He didn't play his commander, either one of them. So he's got Ancestral that's set to 1 counter yet left, and it's gonna resolve next turn. So I decide I'm gonna pull a little trick on my opponent here. So Ancestral goes on the stack, and in response, I cast Grim Monolith. And I do it now because if I were to find a Stifle effect, of course I have one. I have Disallow. But my opponent's playing Stifle, so he's got to be, have Stifle on his head. So what I do is I'm going to Factor Fiction, and he's going to think that I'm digging for Stifle, right? And I've got 1 blue up, and I intentionally, I'm glad actually that I don't have 2 blue up, because this looks weaker than it actually is. So with Factor Fiction on the stack, in response to Ancestral Vision's last suspend trigger, my opponent Cryptic Commands and chooses to draw a card. With that on the stack, so he's going to counter Factor Fiction. I flash out Notion Thief, and this was the setup, right? And thankfully, of course, he dismembered Weathered Wayfarer, so he cannot dismember here. And Notion Thief hits. Cryptic counters, I draw. Ancestral Vision has to happen. My opponent chooses to target himself, and I draw 3. And with that, he just gives up. So I just drew, he just Ancestraled me. I think that's probably game over. And we move on to the next opponent. And apparently my opponent agrees. So the next opponent was Ghostly Logic. And Ghostly Logic is playing Baral. All right, so I win the die roll, which is very nice. I decide to tuck a Lightning Bolt against Baral because I don't have immediate red, and put a Jace into my hand. So that way on turn 2 I can demonic and just cross your fingers and hope it sticks, and it does. So I go get Ancient Tomb. He goes, oh my gosh, so good. Turn 2 Sapphire Medallion, which means I get to Jace, and I Jace into, well, the hand that you see there. Opponent, for his turn, preordains, and then bounces Jace, leaving exactly 1 blue up. So I go for Merchant Scroll, hoping to go get Daze. He negates that, which allows me to play Dak Faden, steal his Sapphire Medallion, and he scoops. If he hadn't negated that, I would have played Dak Faden, which I would have gone and got Daze, and then I would have played Dak Faden. He would have negated the Dak, and I would have dazed anyway and stole his Sapphire Medallion. So it was good for me no matter what. And that's it. I think we're on to, what is this last round? That was a very fast 13 minutes against Brawl. Is one of the fastest games I played against Brawl, I think. And finally, I'm playing Nuclear, which is, I believe, a fan of the channel. And I have an excellent hand. So he's going first. He's playing Vile Smasher Thrasios. A little different from, at least he's not playing the total, dots net deck, which is cool. So I go first turn land tax and pass. He plays around tax, which is wise, but I demonic tutor. I'm holding Daze, first of all. Secondly, I demonic tutor for Skrullak to complete the combo. And then he plays Vial of Souls into Thrasios, so I can't actually Daze that. So I just run out Skrullak and pass. And now I just need him to play a spell, and I can Daze into active tack. So on my turn, so he doesn't play a card. So on my turn, I impulse into Polluted Delta, which I can sack and fail to find. So if he plays a third land, I can turn tax on. But he plays a third land in order to get True Name Nemesis down. So I brainstorm in response in order to better prepare myself for the subsequent turn, which is going to involve some very sick merfolks. I find Izzet Boilerworks and use that to pick up one of my lands, so we're still playing land tax games. Imperial Seal, main phase, on the next turn. And then Scroll Rack into the thing I Imperial Sealed for, which is Mox Diamond. So pass for the turn. So now I've got active Disallow and active Daze. I didn't say Jace. Anyway, drew a Watery Grave for the turn. Do nothing. Decided to Scroll Rack a few cards away. Trying to play around. I want to keep Ravages near the top of my deck, but it doesn't necessarily mean I want it right now. I play Notion Thief just to see what's going to happen. Nothing happens, so I attack. My opponent is carefully avoiding tax, but on his turn, he goes to his end step with 8 cards in hand, so I go ahead and set a Ravages of War on top with an Ancient Tomb underneath it, and just Vampiric away the whole lot. My opponent discards Dreadbore, so now I know he's not sandbagging, because he would surely play a land in Dreadbore Notion Thief over discarding if he could. So the card I Vampiric tutored for was Dak Faden. My turn, I play a land, cast Dak with Disallow, backup, plus Daze. I make him discard, but he doesn't fight me over it at all. I make him discard 2 cards. I take Treachery and Fatal Push. I draw 2 cards, Finding Anguished Unmaking and Fact or Fiction. And at that, my opponent finally gives up. So I had 2 effectively game-winning combos in play, Tax Rack and Thief Dak. So either way, it was going to be really good for me. There's very little my opponent could do in this situation. If you were to play a creature, I just get the Palace Jailer it. Now I'm drawing extra cards per turn. If you were to play anything else, I can potentially disallow and or daze. And if you were to play a land and try to cast something and I daze it, well then I'm on the Tax Rack and we're off to the races. So I don't think this was a winnable game for my opponent at this point in the game. Anyway, and that's what we want. We're trying to win. So I hope you enjoyed the games. I'll go back to the deck list, one last peek at it. And that's all I've got. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.